So we're now into how democracies die. So there are two ways that democracies die. What are they? All right, what happened in Chile? First story that he talks about. What happens in Chile? Come on, it's not that hard. If you read it, it's not that hard. Yeah?
Guns and politics?
The military invaded the palace and killed Salvador Allende. And how much the CIA did or did not have to do with that, we are just going to let that question sit there. But it is absolutely true that that's what happened, right? Tanks in the streets, army mobilizing, coming in to the palace, finding the president, assassinating him, and taking over. Salvador Allende was the duly elected president of Chile, won the election fair and square. He was a socialist. So again, not asking questions about the CIA, not relevant in this context, but that's one of the reasons why the military intervened, and that's how democracy died in Chile. All right? What is the other way that democracies die? Noah. Say it louder.
Just like participating in politics in the country, but then also doing everything legally.
So, the subversion of democracy happens how? How does it start?
It's like internal.
Well, this person gets elected, right? This person is elected through a completely democratic process. And that is the most important point. They are valid they are made valid, rendered valid through this democratic process. They won the election. They got the majority vote. And now they're in office. And then what do they do? How do they move from that to authoritarianism? Yes?
In the example of Venezuela, Chavez became a dictator slowly, just first taking away free and fair elections and just taking power away in that respect.
That's right. But the only thing I would say is there was no, and this is the argument they make, there's no point at which you say, oh, democracy's gone, right? Oh my God, look what he did. It's over. We're now an authoritarian regime. It is chipping away. It's slow. It's methodical. It's deliberate. It's figuring out all the countervailing forces of power in the society and taking that power away or constricting that power. And in a democracy, by design, there are all kinds of different sources of power in a society. We talked about some of them last week. What are they? If you're the president of the United States, what are countervailing sources of power? There's a million of them. Please, just shut them out.
Court system.
Court system. What else? Come on. Yeah?
Yeah, separate legislative body.
All right, so Congress, courts. All right, so now we have the executive, judicial, and come on, Chris. Executive, and legislative. All right. That's three. What else?
Intelligence services.
Other bureaucratic agencies, right? Who does Trump call the enemy of the people? The media, right? Right? So somebody who is understood to be the fourth estate. Does everybody know what that means? It's really important. All right. So it comes from France, right? And it was, you had the peasants, the royalty, the aristocracy, and the press was the fourth estate, the fourth source of independent power in the society. And in democracy, right, Jefferson said if I had to have free elections or free press, and I could only have one, I'd rather have free press. So there's no disputing the independent power of the media. What else? This is a country with how many states? 50, right? And every one of those states has its own legislative, judicial, and executive branch. And so California right now is saying, you know what, we like our own gas mileage regulations, and we don't want to go back. And because we are, in effect, the 5th largest economy in the world, go ahead. Tell the car manufacturers that they don't have to worry about us. Go ahead. When Obama was president, the Solicitor General of the state of Texas said, every day I wake up and I figure out a way to sue the federal government. Oh, good, an update's ready to install. So the point is that every one of these states is also an independent source of power. So in a democracy, this is no small thing, and it's no easy task, because ideally, every one of these independent sources of power doesn't want their power to be constrained, right? If I'm the governor of Texas and you tell me you can't do that, that we're gonna stop it, what's your natural reaction? To fight back, right? Actually, I can't, anyway. So the point is that the only way this works is if it's subverted slowly in barely visible steps. I think that's actually from the book. Barely visible steps. And yeah, all right, so who can tell me the frog in the hot water metaphor? Come on, it's not, yeah, but you all know it, right? All right, who wants to explain it? What is it? Come on, what is it? You don't know what I'm talking about? Or you just don't want to tell?
I'm not sure.
All right, okay, yes.
If you put a frog in cold water
Uh-huh.
and turn on the boiler and let it boil, it won't realize that it's in boiling water until it's too late.
All right, yes, but the point of that is that if you turn on the heat right away, the frog knows it's boiling and it jumps out immediately. If you turn it up slowly, the frog doesn't realize it's getting warmer until it's too late and the frog boils. Now, as a point of fact, that is patently false. Frog is not that stupid, the frog will jump out. But it's a really good metaphor, right? Because the point is that when things are happening very, very, very slowly, it's hard to know, all right, this is when we got to jump. I mean, I wasn't sure last time, but now I am sure we got to jump. But the point is that the difference between that frog and any democracy is that we're all in the pot. Everybody is in the pot. And so all these frogs are talking about what's going on, and they're arguing. So some frog says, you know what, I think it's fine. I think it's really pretty good. And some frog says, you know, actually, I really feel like this is a long time coming. I'm really glad it's getting hotter in here. And there's some frog that says, getting hotter? I don't know what you're talking about. I'm watching whatever, Last Man Standing, or the singer with the mask. Anyway, the masked singer. Anyway, whatever it is you're doing, you just don't care about the temperature in the water. And there's some people who are saying, I really think this is a problem, guys. I really think we should think about jumping out. And so it's not simply a matter of the fact that it is going up slowly. It's also that not everybody sees it the same. And not everybody, and all these people are arguing with each other. All right? That is a metaphor that we will return to again. All right, so the other thing that the book talks about is that these strategies are remarkably similar. So, I mean, we'll get to it, but page 23, 24, right? There's the four things. Again, these two scholars had not done a single thing about the United States. One was Latin America and one was Europe. So one was looking at what happened with Mussolini and with France and with Belgium and with Germany right before World War II. And Latin America in the 70s had this big push towards authoritarianism. So you had basically the military running just about every country in Latin America. So it's not this time and it's not this continent. And they started talking, they said, you know, I'm seeing a lot of things that seem very familiar to me. And the other guy said, yeah, me too. And so that's where this comes from. And the other, the person, somebody referenced it in their paper, the scholar who was writing from the 50s. Can't remember, it starts with an L. It doesn't matter. Anybody remember? All right, anyway, yeah. Lintz, exactly, thank you, thank you. That's definitely a brownie point. All right, so he made the same argument in the 50s. So it is worth keeping in mind that there isn't much new going on here. These are patterns that have been repeated through history. And now happens to be a time where it's being repeated many times in many different places. But it looks and behaves in very similar ways. All right. So that's the argument. You're reading this. Is it persuasive to you? Does it make sense? Does it sound familiar to you? I mean, does it have a, all right, let me ask you this. In the first page, I'm just going to read it because I want to make sure that it's clear that I'm reading this. Over the past few years, we have watched politicians say and do things that are unprecedented in the United States, but they we recognize as having been the precursors of democratic crisis in other places. We feel dread, as do so many other Americans, even as we try to reassure ourselves that things really can't be that bad here. So do you feel a sense of dread? Does that seem over the top to you? I mean, what do you think, Noah?
I thought it was very exaggerative the whole time, in the introduction in chapter 1, because I think it took an overarching view of maybe a few signs of what someone who might transition a country towards authoritarianism might do in their process of it.
Mm-hmm.
But when they were talking about relating it to the United States and their viewpoint on the direction our country's going, it just felt a little weird. I don't see that.
Okay.
I follow politics and news
And how many of you think agree with that? Nobody else agrees with that? All right, so how many of you feel dread? All right, tell me about dread.
The way I related it, personally, is what I read about the NSA over the years.
Mm-hmm.
It started when I was 6 months old with the Patriot Act.
Wait, you weren't reading about the NSA when you were six months old. Okay, that's good.
That's when the story starts.
Got it.
And so now it's just this big monster that collects infinite amounts of data
Mm-hmm.
around the whole world, and we, the people, have no say about it. It's all handled by bureaucrats and government agencies. And
the Patriot Act increased their powers exponentially, right? There's Gene Hackman and Will Smith are in a movie that you should really see. I can't remember the name of it, but this guy works for the NSA, and he's just saying all these things that I know to be so, right? I mean, there are, if you have a phone call, an international phone call, and you say certain words, bomb, I don't know what all the words are, but if you say those words, there is software that will automatically start recording that conversation. If you say, I bombed on Broadway, that could trigger it and then of course they don't keep it, but right? And there's reasons why they're doing that, but it's also, clearly an invasion of privacy. Okay, all right, anybody else feel dread? Yes?
I was listening to a podcast that kind of related to this, and they were talking about how just in the government there are so many open positions in our government, and there have been open positions and replacements
And acting
throughout even the past 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And to me that really related to a lot of the points in here, and maybe
How so?
the shifting of the power that all these, it's just everything's so partisan that nothing can get done.
Uh-huh.
And that includes who's going to be in these seats making these decisions. And to me, it seems like that's a big power shift that's happened.
So most cabinet positions, I think, except for the NSA, every cabinet position has to be affirmed by the Senate. Unless the cabinet secretary is acting. And so I don't remember how many positions right now are acting, but that means they have not gone to the Senate for confirmation. And so there is a way in which that takes power away from the legislative branch. It just does, right? If my Secretary of Defense doesn't if I'm saying that person doesn't require your approval, right? I mean, that is, and I mean, I think that's a really good example of the kind of little nick, right? It's not a big deal in and of itself that there's an acting Secretary of Defense. That happens, right? But if there are more than one, or if this is part of a pattern of denigrating or delegitimizing the countervailing power of the legislative branch, then it becomes a big deal. And then it becomes a question of just asking, is this a big deal? Is this part of a pattern? Is this something we should be concerned about? All right, so let me give you an example. This enemy of the people phrase. I was in an argument with a very smart guy who listened to our podcast and said we didn't put enough pro-Trump voices on it. And he said, you know, enemy of the people, you know, how is this bad? How is this bad? I mean, New York Times, Washington Post, they have increased their readership by exponentially, right? They have more subscribers than they ever had. How is this bad? How is this hurting journalism? How is this hurting the First Amendment? And so that's the kind of frog argument that you see going on, because that is not an indefensible position, right? He's saying, look, he's talking this, he's saying this, but what's the impact? What's really happening? How is it really bad? How is he countervailing their power? If anything, he's giving them more power. Anybody want to guess how I responded? Yeah.
I mean, I would say that, yeah, certain people are going to read more, but I would also think that, you know, Trump supporters and people that align with him would be significantly less likely to read those sources, and you don't have information being spread throughout society. It's more concentrated in certain sects, and then you get like bubbles. I think
that's a very good argument. In other words, if you think that there's a subset of the media that is your enemy, then why should you be interested in what they have to say? Why should you take them as an important countervailing voice? You know, telling you what the truth is. If you think they're your enemy, you're not going to listen to them, right? So that's number one. The other thing is, in Turkey, in Hungary, in the Philippines, the dictators in those countries have said, that's fake news. The press is the enemy of the people. And these are in countries that have far less well-established and far less powerful media organizations. So it may not be a disaster in the United States, but it may very well be a disaster in Egypt or in the Philippines, where these organizations are just kind of hanging on by a thread, right? And they're not well established and they don't have a lot of resources. There's a lot of media people who have suddenly ended up dead in Russia. And if you think of those people as enemy of the people, well then, you know, I mean, that just changes your evaluation of that reality. Anyway, but that's a really good example of this frog thing, right? Because we're seeing the same thing, and we're evaluating it in fundamentally different ways. And so it's because it's just a chip, It's just another little thing, right? Oh, it's just him tweeting again. And, you know, that could be true. Or it could be yet another effort to undermine the countervailing power that stops him from doing what he wants and becoming an authoritarian. Yes?
I think, like, so when I was reading it, I kind of, like, I mean, like, I understood, like, the sense of dread and weariness, but to, like, qualify what I said earlier, too, like, I think it takes bigger actions and more momentum to fully, like, undermine a democracy.
Sure.
Because I think, like, I'm just looking at, like, what Trump has done in the past 4 years, like, but if he were to completely ignore, like, the next election and still, like, say, like, oh, no, that's not, like, a free and fair election and stay in power regardless of, like, whatever the election results will be in 2020, then I would be concerned. But I just feel like because we have, like, 4-year term limits or 4-year terms for presidents, like, it's a lot harder to do damage, maybe.
Again, a very good example. Anybody know how many times the president has joked about extending his term past 8 years? 6, 7 times? Are they jokes? They're probably just jokes, right? They're just probably jokes. I mean, how do you evaluate that, right? How do you say, oh, well, they're just jokes? Or how do you say, or do you say, no, they're not just jokes? And how do you argue that one way or the other with somebody who takes a different point of view? Here's the only thing I would say. If your objective was to make it more likely for you to stay in office after your 8 years were up, would it help you or hurt you to make those jokes? Well, would it make it more likely or less likely for you to be able to do that?
I think making those jokes would make it less likely that you're able to do it, because if you're kind of, like, introducing the concept, you're showing, like, the general public, like, that you have the desire to stay in power.
But they're just jokes. All I'm saying is that I think it puts the idea in people's heads in a way that they weren't there before. It wasn't there before. And anyway, I mean, but again, all this is to just reiterate the idea that these are tiny little steps. There's no obvious point. Yes?
Just to, like, piggyback off of what you just said about the little chips, I think that also holds value with, like, how many fallacies and lies that it's proven that President Trump says. And, like, this has nothing to do with, like, my personal stance or anything. Like, fact is fact. And you will see, like, established Republican elected officials go on television and in the press and defend proven lies and try to spin them towards an audience for party alliance. And I think that that's what I dread the most, is that like, people that we elect care more about their party and being loyal to them versus just admitting when something is wrong. And it's okay. Like, I feel like that's more okay than just...
It's really interesting, and I think it's a really good point. And I'm just trying to go through here and find and think about where it is that he says anything about that. And I don't know that they say anything about that. And I don't know that there is. But there's a very little book called On Tyranny. And On Tyranny is just literally, it's like 50 pages. It's short. And it's meant to be. And it's just got, here's what tyrannical regimes do. And one of the chapters in there says that what a tyrannical regime will do is throw so much dirt in the air that you don't know what the truth is. They don't necessarily say, this is a lie, this is the truth. They just throw so much stuff that you just don't have a lot of solid ground on which to stand. And if you feel that way, you don't necessarily have an ability to evaluate whether something's good or bad. If you can't start on a foundation of, all right, well, this much I know. If you can't do that, it becomes very difficult. And I think it's really interesting to me that you bring that up, because, like I say, I don't know that that's in this book very much. I'm actually working on something. 1984, right? You know that book Well, the memory hole. We were at war with Oceania, and now we're at war with Asia, Eurasia. And, oh, no, 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 we've always been at war with Eurasia. I mean, it's literally you just switching. And there is no truth, there is no history except what the party says. And so I do think there is an argument that that truth is an ally of democracy and lies are an enemy of democracy. That's not to say that politicians don't lie. They do. They lie all the time. And sometimes it's a moral thing to do. I mean, if somebody, you know, if you are at war, or if you are in these secret negotiations with the other side to get some policy passed, and it's touch and go, and somebody says, are you trying to get this policy passed? And you know that if it becomes public, it's not going to happen, you may be constrained to lie, right? So it's not to say that the standards of honesty are categorical. For a politician, they're just not. But if you are unable to commit to the idea that that there are a common set of facts about which we can then argue, then it becomes more difficult to sustain a democracy. I did not expect to go there, but I think it's a really good point. All right. The other thing that's just a throwaway line here on page 1. Hold on. It's not going to take me long. After all, even though we know democracies are always fragile, the one in which we live has somehow managed to defy gravity. Democracies are always fragile. I think in my lifetime, it is only now that people believe that to be so. I don't think that when I was in, you know, college or high school that people thought that. I don't think they thought it was fragile. In matter of fact, anybody heard of John Rawls? He's a really famous political philosopher. All right. So John Rawls had this thing called the overlapping moral consensus, where everybody comes at a liberal democracy from their own point of view, but their moral values all kind of overlap. And he says that because we've all lived in this democracy long enough, that overlapping consensus has gotten very powerful. And it keeps us together, even when there's enough stuff to kind of separate us. I don't think anybody would make that argument anymore. Not right now. Maybe they would, but it's certainly less self-evident than it was when John Rawls wrote it. I'll give you another example. So I have a colleague here who went to graduate school with an individual who's now a radical political theorist. His life's work has been pointing out the deficiencies of, you know, American democratic free enterprise, the system, right? He has been advocating for radical reform. And I'm getting this secondhand, take it for what it's worth, but he told this colleague of mine that he didn't realize that his entire career has been premised on the idea that democracy was okay, was solid, was safe. And now suddenly it's like, maybe that's just not so true. So I think the idea of fragility is just more in the air right now. And the reason I bring that up is because last week, I mean, I will give you a nickel if you can remember what was the problem that the Greeks identified with democracy. The reason that people looked at Athens and it scared them, what was it? What happened? What did they do? All right. Killed Socrates. Is that what you're going to say? Yeah, they killed Socrates, right? The greatest philosopher in Western civilization, they killed him. So the point is that even this, epitome of democracy in the classic world fell victim to this populist rage and to demagogues and ended up doing this thing that was terrible. So, one concern about democracy has been there from the core. It's here now. Democracies are fragile because you're giving power to people who may be susceptible, who may be easily swayed, who will let their emotions run away with them. And then with Rome, the problem was that after all this conquest, there was all this wealth, there was huge inequality in the community. The Senate knew they had to do something about it, and they didn't. They knew there was a problem, and they were unable to come together on a solution. And that led to civil wars, to demagogues, and ultimately to the replacement of the Roman Republic with the Roman Empire and with the Roman Emperor. So, people look around and they see problems like climate change or gun violence or you name it, and they say, our government is doing nothing about this. Our government passes fewer laws every session. Our government is sclerotic and hopelessly deadlocked, and if this is what democracy is, not so sure I want to sign on. There's got to be a better way to address these problems than having these yahoos drone on and on and on in service of their own egos and how much time they get on CNN as opposed to genuinely solving problems. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Right? So, again, from Rome to now, from Athens to now, the same issues about democracy have always been there, and they've always identified a basic fragility. There's something unstable, unreliable about democracy, because all these things can happen at any time. All right, any comments about that? Okay, let me see where I am. So this is apropos of nothing, but MLK Day was yesterday. It's not apropos of nothing. It actually is germane, but it's not. It doesn't follow from anything we've talked about. But I've written on King a lot. I know King, but I had never heard this quote, and it strikes me as pretty relevant. So we are faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. So think about that with respect to the frog metaphor. So there's somebody who's saying, climate change is a thing. It's a thing right now. We're already behind the game. If we don't do this right now, we could lose everything. And there's other people saying, I don't know. Anyway, and extending the metaphor of the heating boiling water, that's a little different, a little too on the nose. But anyway, all right. I'm just. All right. So, let me pull this up. I actually worked hard enough to do it, so I'm hoping that it'll come up. Come on, there we go. All right. And there, and there. All right, so have any of you seen this graph? Okay, perfect. Really? Let's try that. Okay. I have no idea why it's doing that. All right, let's just, can you see it at all? You can't see it at all, can you? Good Lord. All right, let me try this again. Let me try.
Oh, it's because you're highlighting everything.
Well, how do I do that?
Just click off somewhere else.
Ah, okay. Thank you. All right. So let's do this. All right. So this is a graph from Yaxis, who was, when he did this, a lecturer at Harvard. Now he's at Johns Hopkins. And the y-axis is the percentage of people who say that it's essential to live in a democracy. So they have a 10-point scale. And the people who say 10, it's absolutely essential to me that we live in a democracy. That's the number of people who answered the question. And the x-axis is the age of the cohort being asked. So I think it's like 80, 70, 60, 30, 40, no. 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20. That's what it is. So, and that's what happened. That's what has happened to the answer to that question. And this is the United States. In political science, I almost defy you to find a graph that steep, a decline that steep and that fast. Some people are extremely freaked out about this, right? So just for the sake of fairness, I want to show you the other graph. So this is from this guy, Eric Bowden, who, I don't remember where he's from, it doesn't matter. But what he did was he took the averages of all 10 answers for every cohort. So it wasn't just who said 10, it was what did they answer. And then he compared that to generational cohort. So, you know, you get, you have a very high starting rate, right? So the average in Australia for 70-year-old people was 9.5, right? And the average for the United States was 8.5. But you still have these declines. Sweden's not a big deal. Netherlands not a big deal. Great Britain's a big deal. United States is a big deal, right? Or at least it's telling us something. And, you know, if you go back to Yaxis, I mean, literally, people were like, oh my, this is, because look, I mean, those people who are 70, they're going to die. And once you die, you can't vote. You can make a joke about Chicago if you want. But anyway, the point is that at a certain point, these people are going to exit the voting rolls. And that means these people down here are going to have more power, have more say in terms of what government does. And if these people feel like, i.e. you people, if they feel like democracy is not worth defending, isn't that great, what happens to democracy? Anyway, so what I want to ask you is, what do your friends think? What do you think? I mean, is this commensurate with your experience? Is this what you think your generation thinks? I mean, what do you think? Well, I mean, if you've had conversations like this, what is your data to bring to this question? And that's all it is. That's all I'm asking. Or do you just never talk about it? Never comes up. Yeah?
I mean, I think from my experience, there's a lot of people that don't really know what a democracy is. You know, so going back to the discussion we had last week, so a lot of people will use like the Republic, Democrat, you know, that sort of we live in a republic thing, but they don't understand, you know, that a democracy encompasses freedoms and liberties. So I think that's where some of the confusion comes from.
Okay, but I mean, they'll talk about their rights, right?
Right.
But they just don't put them together.
They don't put democracy and rights together.
Does that ring true to you guys? Yeah? That it's just not something that people talk about? How many, yeah?
I think a lot of people I know don't really know the depth of what democracy actually is. They just see events that happen during their lifetime. Like, I know just for me personally, like, Iraq War, like 2008, like housing bust and things like that, and you associate that with government all the time, constantly, but you don't realize what, like, the institutions that are in play every single day, people that like go to work every single day just to make sure that we can live the way that we do. And people don't think that deep into it, they just associate with.
Well, I mean, I think that is another way of saying what I was saying about taking, democracy being fragile. I think it used to be the case that that was what most people thought. And really, John Adams said, I study war so my son can study politics, so my grandchildren can study arts and literature. So the point is that in a democracy, you're making it possible for people not to care about democracy, if it's working well. Anyway, I had something, but it's completely gone. Well, so, here's what I was going to say. So in 2014, 2018 was the last midterm election. And in 2014 was the one before that. In 2014, the cohort of 18 to 30-year-olds, 19% voted. It's 1 in 5. That means that includes young professionals, that includes college students, that includes people just out of high school, 1 in 5. And in 2018, it was 31%. So it still wasn't quite 1 in 3. And in 4 years, that's a 50% increase. That's really big, but it's still not very big number. So how many people talk about politics at all? Do they talk about Donald Trump? Do they talk about what happened in Iran? Do they talk about climate change? Anything like that? I mean, it must come up, right? Well, what do they say? What is it? Well, you tell me. What?
Just saying, my roommates say they want socialism.
They do.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people your age that do, right? I mean, that's most of Bernie Sanders' support, right? Does that mean, in your mind, are they thinking that socialism instead of democracy, or yes?
Yeah, but I don't think they understand what also would be at stake. That's
Well, all right. And so, where does this? Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you talk about socialism as like an economic framework, or as in like what would that entail in place of democracy?
Oh, I don't know that it would. I mean, first of all, socialism is a very broad term, and most of the time when people use it, they're not really talking about socialism. If you're talking about workers' control of the means of production, there aren't a lot of factories anymore. So it just doesn't make sense to talk about it in the same way that you would. And if you're talking about Bernie Sanders, he's really a social democrat, and he's following in a pattern that's like Sweden. Sweden was socialist, and they said, this is terrible. And so they went to social democracy, and now, Scandinavian countries have the highest satisfaction, happiness scale of any countries. I'm just putting it out there. It's a fact. But there's nothing undemocratic about those countries, right? And so it is not, I mean, there are arguments to be had about how free a society is if you have socialized medicine, for example, or if you have, they call it cradle to grave socialism, right? So you basically have every stage of your life, you are dependent on the government for some service, right? So you don't have to pay for college, or you pay just a pittance for books and things like that in Denmark, right? But your tax rate in Denmark is like 60%, right? So is that an unacceptable diminution of freedom? Is that undermining the incentive to go out and make yourself rich? That's an argument, right? I mean, but the idea that you can't have social democracy and a democracy I just don't think it's true, right? That's what I would say. Okay. Where was I going? Shit. Anyway, so what I'm hearing from you all is that there is a pretty significant amount of detachment from these questions and a pretty good amount of ignorance about these questions. Do you think that's fair? Am I summarizing this fairly? Do you know when the voting rate for this cohort, 18 to 30-year-olds, was the highest? A wild stab in the dark. It's been in the last 70 years. Yeah.
During Vietnam,
Vietnam War. Why would that be a big thing?
they passed a constitutional amendment to lower the vote.
They did, but why did they do that?
Because you could go to war for your country where you couldn't vote.
You couldn't vote and you couldn't have a drink.
Yeah.
But you could go fight and die for your country. And people are like, really? And so they lowered the drinking age, which has now all been raised back up. And they also lowered the voting age, right, through a constitutional amendment. But the point is that all these young people saw voting as being directly in their interest. I would rather not go to Vietnam, and if voting is the one way I can make sure that doesn't happen, I'm going to vote. And I don't want to go to Vietnam. I don't want to be drafted, right? Because at that point, you could still get drafted. Anyway, so all I'm saying is, by process of elimination, what's going on here is that young people are only a third of them see these issues as being in their interest. Or only a third of them think that the electoral process is the right way to address this. Yes?
I just have an interesting statistic just to kind of add on to that, but I did a ton of stuff with outreach on campus for voter registration for the last municipal elections, and we increased the percentage a lot, but I was shocked to learn that in 2015, only 120 students voted on campus, and in 2017, it was 180. So that's really evident in local politics.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people don't live here, and so I mean, yeah, I've had conversations with the League of Women Voters about this. They're like, "Why don't we get?" I'm like, "Well, if you live in Altoona, what do you care about this Center County?" And I mean, anyway, so I guess I can kind of understand that, but anyway, but I do think it is. I'm not trying to make a shame on you, eat your peas argument here, right? What's the point of that? Yes.
There's also probably a lot of people that don't see their vote counting, and they don't think that the electoral process works for them.
Or at all, right? People say, look, there's so much money in politics. That's what's controlling the elections. That's who the politicians are working for. Voting is just is a choice between two basically the same things, right? And neither of them are going to change things in the way that I want. And again, you see Bernie Sanders as speaking directly to that feeling, right? Anyway, so I think that is an accurate assessment of how people are feeling. But again, my point is not to say, shame on them for feeling that way. My point is to say that this is yet another manifestation, this is a data point with respect to the fragility of democracy, and why people right now see it as more fragile than they would have, say, 50 years ago. Okay. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. All right. So the other thing I want to, I mean, there's a couple other things I want to draw to your attention. There is this absolutely chilling story about Hitler. You remember this? Right? And I actually, I mean, doesn't matter. Von Papen, one of the chief, this is on page 15. Von Papen, one of the chief architects of the plan, dismissed worries over the gamble that would make Adolf Hitler chancellor of a crisis-ridden Germany with the reassuring words, "We've engaged him for ourselves. Within 2 months, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner that he'll squeal." The hubris of that statement and the incorrectness of that calculation is just overwhelming. And it is in every politician's interest, once they're elected, to preserve enough of the status quo so that they will get reelected. And because of that, they will inevitably perceive the world in ways that allow them to have their self-interest conform to the right thing to do. And in that way, they are no different from any other human being on this planet. We all have biases that are associated with our self-interest. And we all perceive the world the way we want it to be rather than the way it is. Because often the way it is unpleasant. And we don't like things that are unpleasant. And our brain is conditioned to help us figure out a way to make that unpleasantness go away. And that action happens before we're even consciously aware of what we're hearing, and it happens beneath consciousness. Do you see what I'm saying here? In other words, it's your amygdala, right? It's your reptilian brain. And its job is to identify threats. And if there's a threat, your objective is to react. It's not to think, it's not to process, it's not to evaluate, it's to react. So have any of you had the experience where you've suddenly jumped and then you're like, why did I jump? You just suddenly react and then you're like, oh, I guess it's that thing. It's nothing. It's just I thought it was something. Does anybody have that experience? That's called an amygdala hijack. And the point is that amygdala is always on, always working, and it's always working crudely because it's working so much faster than the rest of your brain. So all of you have this pattern of behavior. So your biases are working before you're even consciously aware of what you're hearing. So this doesn't, all my point is just that there's no difference between politicians and you. I mean, it's not like, oh, look at that, they're in power, all they want to do. We all do this. And it's very difficult not to do this. As a matter of fact, I'll say it even more strongly. You can't not do this. All you can do is learn to mitigate the effects. You can't turn this off. This isn't a part of your brain that you cannot reach through your conscious self. It's like saying, I'm going to control the way that my ears work. You can't do that, right? And it's the same thing with your amygdala. Anyway, that was a little sidebar, but the point is that politicians are looking for ways to conform their self-interest with what the right thing to do is. And that's how this sort of thing happens. And I heard some of you saying this about Republicans, and I think I said it to everyone who said it. What would happen if the situation were reversed in terms of party? It's not exactly the same now, but in my experience, politicians are absolutely united in their pursuit of two things: money and votes. And if you can give them one of those things, they will listen to you. And if you can't, they won't. and it doesn't matter what party they're in, right? And so for most of my life, I felt like there's been little difference in terms of the behavior of politicians. And I think that's true not just here, but throughout the world. And so I think that has to be part of your evaluation of what's going on in the Republican Party right now. Okay, so, what time is it? Okay. Let me just see. I don't want to miss something. Populism. I want you guys to have some sense of what that means and how it's relevant. Anybody want to take a stab at what a populist is? I mean, it's not... All right, let me ask you this. Can you come up with any examples of a populist in American history? Yeah.
Trump.
All right, fair enough. Okay. Who else? Anybody else? Huey Long ring a bell? George Wallace ring a bell? Anything you can say about them? So, William Jennings Bryan. So, a populist is somebody who says, you guys, remember when we said Demos Krasia, right? The regular Joe and Jill, the regular guy and gal, the people who are just out there, rust bucket, going through their lives, trying to make their ends meet, right? Those people. The populist appeals directly to them, and they say, you are getting screwed. You are being treated unfairly by this society. And the people who are in charge, or alternatively, the people who are really in charge are out to make it your life difficult. At best, they don't care about you. At best. At worst, they're out to make your lives more difficult. They're out to take from you and give you nothing in return. So, what you need is me. You need me to speak for you. You need me to represent you. You need me to fight for you. Because you can't win otherwise. And the fact that you're in the position you're in shows you that I'm right. There's somebody who's responsible for you being in this position. And it's not your fault. And so I am here to right those wrongs and put you back in a position where you can succeed. That's a populist. A populist doesn't have to be right wing. Chavez was a populist on the left wing. As a matter of fact, it's almost 50-50 in terms of which way they go. It's a politician seeing an opportunity in terms of numbers to get power. And the way they do that is by saying, oh, here is this population that feels resentment, that feels mistreated. And if I can pitch myself to them, and quite honestly, most times they might actually believe it, right? That there are times when these people get treated unfairly, right? I mean, if you look at what's happened to the minimum wage in the last 20 years, and then what's happened to the income of the top 1%, there's an argument there, right? I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying there's a reason for people's feeling of dissatisfaction, of resentment. And the populist strives to exploit that feeling and use it to say, I'm your solution. You have a problem. It's not your fault. It's these other people, and I will fight for you. Does that sound familiar? Anybody? You said Trump. How does that sound like Trump?
I think it's anyone who's not centrist, really, because you can also apply the argument that Bernie Sanders is a populist.
Yes. All right, make that argument.
Well, because he's appealing to specifically college students. We see the lack of accessible health care in the country, lack of affordability of higher education, and he's kind of drawing on our frustrations with our societal issues and then using that to like garner support for ourselves as well. But like for Trump, he appealed to like deep-rooted like racist beliefs in our country and like a lot of other like unfashionable topics.
But how are they the same?
Well, you're kind of like pulling the support of like a large amount of people who are unhappy with the current situation.
Who feel mistreated, who feel like there's something unfair about society, right? Sanders and Warren both make this argument, right? When I went to college, it was like $6,000, $8,000 a year, and it was a private school. And, you know, I paid my loans off. I mean, well, actually, I didn't because I went to graduate school. But most people are able to pay their loans off pretty soon. And, you know, if I can do it, what's your problem? You know, you guys are going to, oh, big deal. You know, we all ought to do it. Just do it. Quit whining, right? And you're saying this is completely unfair. It's completely different. And as a parent of college students, I'm inclined to agree with that argument. But regardless, you're saying this is not right. You're putting this level of debt on me that's going to mean I have to delay getting married. I have to delay getting a house. I'm delaying my entry into, you know, mainstream life, and I have to do that because if I don't, I'm not in a position to compete. And you're saying that's fine, and it's not fine, right? That is a very populist argument. Although it's ironic because you're talking to the minority of people your age who are actually going to college, right? I mean, I think it's 23%, I could be wrong about that, of Americans have college degrees. It's higher. It's going up every year. And so, you know, there's more than 23% now, but it's not the majority of Americans. All right, I just want to read what they say, and then you can tell me if I'm right. This is on page 22. Populists are anti-establishment politicians, figures who, claiming to represent the voice of the people, wage war on what they depict as a corrupt and conspiratorial elite. Mark that word, conspiratorial. Populists tend to deny the legitimacy of established parties, attacking them as undemocratic and even unpatriotic. They tell voters that the existing system is not really a democracy, but instead has been hijacked, corrupted, or rigged by the elite. And they promise to bury that elite and return the power to the people. Yes?
So when Trump was running for election, he kept saying drain the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would exactly relate to that because obviously it's saying the politicians are all corrupt.
Well, and even unelected bureaucrats,
Yeah.
right, they are the ones who are controlling the way society runs. They're controlling how these laws get enacted, and they're doing it in ways that are stepping all over your livelihood as a coal miner, as a truck driver, as somebody who's trying to get their factory started, right? And so, and the other thing about drain the swamp, again, conspiratorial. They're not telling you what they're really doing. They're not going to be upfront about it. But behind the scenes, trust me, they're doing it. And that's why you're in the situation you're in. Yes?
It's also present, like, as a Warren supporter, like, I know in a bunch of her ads, she uses the words, like, it's corruption, pure and simple, we must root it out. Like, that's one of her most repeated, like, slogans in her campaign ads. So, like, I think it's interesting to see it on both sides.
Well, I mean, it is going to be on both sides, right? I mean, and let's face it, that strategy got Donald Trump elected. So if that's where the electorate is, yes.
It's also almost impossible to deny, because how do you deny that someone's not doing something that's like behind the scenes, right?
Absolutely true.
You can't
Absolutely
argue
true.
against it.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the attraction because it doesn't really require evidence, right? It doesn't require you to say, and gee, that's not clear to me. It doesn't seem to me obvious that that's going on. Well, that's just sign that they're so good at it and they're so conspiratorial and they're so behind the scenes. Well, you can't argue with that. You can't argue out of that the absence of evidence is evidence, right? All right. So let's see. All right, anybody have any questions? Anything you want to push back on? Anything that you're not clear on? Yes?
So if populism has infected our democracy, what's next? Like,
Well, what happened? I mean, what was next in Rome? And what replaced it? Yeah, you do. And the Roman emperor replaced it. The emperor who was a quasi-deity, right? It wasn't just this person, he was godlike, right? And so what happens when you denigrate democracy, when democracies die, is you end up with some version of authoritarianism. Some version in which all or some people don't have the rights they did, and they don't have the freedom they did, and they don't have the power that they did, or at least, yeah, that they did, because all these people come through the electoral process. All right, so the only other thing I want to do is just make sure that you're aware of page 23 and 24. I mean, this is like the page, this is the description of how authoritarians become authoritarians. This is the playbook, literally the playbook. If you're duly elected and you want to become a dictator, these are the things you do. And how well you do them and how willing you are to do them little by little will determine how successful you are. But their argument is that this is almost theoretical, right? This is born from experience, but if you want to do this, this is what you do. And their argument is, you find me an example of a person who's duly elected who becomes an authoritarian, and I will show you all the things on this list that they did. That's their argument. It's not like, well, it happened here, it didn't happen here. No. These things happen every single time. And so, moving on. All right, so anyway. So, yeah, you should have that in your head. And you should be thinking about that, even if you just want to tag it, and then whenever you're reading something else, go back, or when you're finding an article, go back, because that is the core of their book. Okay? All right, so next week, the article is not in this book, because this book is called How Democracies Die, and there's nothing really in here about why democracies die. And so that is my one class that I try to talk about that, because I think it's relevant, right? Why is this happening now? What is going on in the world that's making this happen? And how similar is it to things that have happened before? So if you know other examples, if you know what happened in Egypt, if you know what happened in Mussolini's Italy, or in Germany's Hitler's Germany, if you know how that happened, then take those features and see how applicable they are to current circumstance. And so that's what we're going to talk about next time. Okay? All right, we're good. All right. Yeah, it's a little early. It's fine. All right. See you later, guys.